Bob Murphy Show, episode 303.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. This episode I'm going to be speaking with Jonathan Bartlett, and our topic is going to be some of his recent work, publications in fact, in peer-reviewed journals regarding intelligent design, or ID. And we're going to start from scratch and just have him tease out some of the overlapping concepts in this area just to avoid confusion, and then we'll jump into the contributions in his published work. Let me just give you a little bit of his bio here. Jonathan Bartlett is a software developer at McElroy Manufacturing, where he builds tablet controls for remote control construction equipment, as well as embedded software development and developing web applications. Jonathan is the author of 10 books and the primary editor of 2 edited volumes of conference papers. His first book, Programming from the Ground Up, has been used in places as diverse as DeVry and Princeton. This was also notable as one of the first full-fledged open-source textbooks and has been translated into a few different languages. His most popular book is Electronics for Beginners, which has been translated into German. He is the author of papers in mathematics, computer science, theoretical biology, and philosophy. In his spare time, Jonathan is the director and primary researcher of the Blythe Institute and is a senior fellow at the Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. As part of the Bradley Center, Jonathan regularly writes for the mindmatters.ai website. Outside of intelligent design, Jonathan has been a reviewer for several mainstream journals on papers dealing with philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. Okay, so as you will see there, he doesn't have a PhD in biology, and that's okay. All right, so the stuff we're going to get into in this, and this is the thing, I understand standard, orthodox, let's call it, defenders of the current Darwinian framework, and in the interview, Jonathan gets real specific about what labels we should actually use for the reigning paradigm, let's say, because it is actually not the same as it would have been 20 years ago. They would say, yeah, this guy's not even a biologist, and he's coming here. But again, so the work we're talking about, I think it's technically a journal of theoretical biology, at least some of his work is published in. But what's going on with the intelligent design people is they are, among other things that's going on, but one definitely true statement I can make is that they're taking results that are fairly standard in information science or information theory and then bringing them to bear in the debate on evolution. All right, and so it's not surprising then that somebody who has, as Jonathan does here, who definitely has a pedigree in terms of computer science, information theory, coming in and dabbling, if that's the word you want to use, into biology and coming up with some results, just trying to show that, hey, this reigning paradigm here has some serious issues with it. All right, and that's, again, I'm anticipating a little bit, but I just want to sort of diffuse your skepticism on the front end. Maybe this isn't a great analogy, but it would be like if some historians are arguing about, and like military historians, are arguing about, hey, how did this great Roman general back in such and such fend off the invading hordes? And then they were looking at his diary, and he said that he started using this new catapult technique that involved basically perpetual motion. So he, that wasn't the terminology he used. Obviously, of course, he wouldn't be writing in English. But from our modern vantage point, he was describing that they started using a perpetual motion machine. And that's how they won the battle, where they were hopelessly outnumbered. So, and these military historians are arguing about that. They're arguing tactics and things. And And so then some physicist comes over to this debate and says, no, guys, what are you talking about? We're quite confident from my field that there's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine. So you can't take this guy's narrative at face value. That can't be what happened. Right? And then you could imagine the military stories. What's your training, sir? Have you even studied military history? I don't think so. Okay, so you can do with that analogy what you will. But that's, in my view, kind of what's going on here. Okay, so without further ado, here is my discussion with Jonathan Bartlett, who's going to be talking about something interesting when it comes to so-called randomness in mutations that is the underpinning of the standard story of, how do we explain the origin of the species and such. And as you'll see, he's going to rely on things that all of us know a little bit about, having to do with the immune system and how that works. And then you'll see that, oh, wait a minute, something that, this idea of a random mutation that then the environment acts upon in terms of fitness. There's a lot more going on with that cute little phrase of random mutation that is interesting at the very least. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Jonathan Bartlett. Jonathan, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, as people would know from my intro already, we're going to be talking about intelligent design, or ID. So before we jump into the fun stuff, maybe just can you explain a little bit about your background and how you came to be publishing on these topics and why anyone should listen to you?
Yeah, so my background is kind of convoluted, and ultimately I would say that if you don't want to listen to me, don't. But kind of the way that I actually, when I grew up, I was not interested in biology at all. I kind of got pushed into biology from having. I've had two children who had a genetic disorder called cytochrome C oxidase deficiency. And because of that, I had to basically learn biology and genetics. And I spent many, many years just studying day and night to help them out because they had a ridiculous amount of care requirements. And one thing that you'll find is that if you are the parent of a special needs kid, whether or not doctors take you seriously depends very heavily on whether or not they think you know what you're talking about. And so, the kind of the difference between being able to talk to a doctor intelligently and them just kind of patting you on the head and saying, go along now and do what I say, is heavily dependent on whether or not you really understand at a deep level what they're saying. And so we spent many years struggling with our children's health, but those two sadly passed. My oldest died when he was about 5.5 years. And after he died, I was like, I've spent all this time studying biology. What would I do with that? And so from that, I kind of went through. I started into kind of the creation movement to some extent, and then I discovered the intelligent design movement, and that really clicked with me. And I started doing more and more research on the subject. And as we went on, I realized, I kind of started it from an apologetics perspective. I've always been a Christian, and I've always tried to focus my life on serving God and serving others. And it just, but it kind of shifted for me as the more I got into it, as I realized that it isn't so much that Christianity needs science to kind of give its blessing to it, but rather that actually science has a need, that there is some missing pieces of science that really are filled by looking at science in different ways. And while you don't necessarily have to be a Christian to look at it that way, I do think being a Christian helps kind of provide a background framework that helps you make better sense of what's happening. So I spent many years studying. You know, when I say I study things, I do it really deeply. I've published in mathematics, even though I'm only self-studied in mathematics. I've published in biology and philosophy, even though I'm actually only self-studied in both of those. So people ask me what my credentials are, and I tell people I don't actually have sufficient credentials to tie my shoelaces in the morning, but I do know how to research different fields and figure out how they work. So I mean, if somebody needs credentials from me, I've written quite a number of books. I mostly on computer science. I have one book, Programming from the Ground Up, that was required. It's been required reading in schools as diverse as DeVry and Princeton. So I've written books on calculus, on let's see here, calculus, philosophy of science, and computer science, and actually one on kind of politics. So I've kind of I tell people I get bored easily is the long and short of it. So anyway, so all that I've been doing intelligent design work for a long time. I know a lot of the people in it. I've run several conferences that are kind of research conferences on intelligent design. I'm an editor of two of the journals that are intelligent design focused, and also, interestingly, just kind of along the way, I've actually had several journals that aren't affiliated with the ID movement ask me to be reviewers for papers and write critical commentaries and that sort of thing.
Okay, so I'm sorry to hear about your children. I didn't know that. I probably wouldn't have been so glib in my introductory question if I realized that was the ultimate motive.
I understand. One of the things that people ask me all the time, how many kids do you have? And that can be a tough. People think it's a simple question, and it winds up being a kind of difficult one to answer. So it's not a problem.
Right, because then you don't know whether to, what they
right.
mean.
Is it 3 or is it 5?
Yeah, and then you don't want to make the person feel awful for having said that, and oh, geez, I was just asking, I was making conversation.
Exactly.
Okay, so, but just I guess to make sure people don't just tune out, what we're gonna get to after we get through some of the fundamentals here is you recently you actually published in biology journals, right?
Yeah. So one of my recent papers, it's indexed in PubMed. So it was in a journal called Acta Biotheoretica, which is a theoretical biology journal. According to my wife, I'm good at anything as long as it's theoretical. So, if you want me to fix the air conditioning in our house, that's a little out of my ball field. But if you want me to, maybe write an equation about how that works, that might be a little bit closer.
Okay. You could definitely look though at it and say some intelligent being designed this thing, just maybe not that intelligent for the air conditioner.
Exactly.
Okay. So why don't we? I think probably let me just make an analogy and tell me how you feel about this, because you're conversant with all these different things. When you were explaining how it's not that Christianity needs science to come in and sort of validate it, but you think it's almost vice versa, that science has certain blind spots, let's say, that someone with a Christian worldview can easily spot and just say, no, guys, you're missing this big thing right here, or you're engaged in a fallacy and you don't even see it. Let me spell it. I take you to be saying your point is not that, unless you are yourself a Christian or believe the Bible, you can't understand anything. That no, you mean you can get into the framework that the secular naturalists are using in their own worldview, show them there's a problem here with what you're doing, and here's it, but it's that you just might not have noticed that had you not been a Christian. Is that my understanding what your claim is?
That's partially true. So, yes, to be certain, there are things where it's a lot easier to point out and say, hey, you're limited here. But I also think there's a wider frame. It's not necessarily that you have to be a Christian to see it, but it's really or to see it or believe it, but that the modern form of atheism doesn't. So this is why. So intelligent design, I like to tell people, it's not really a theory of origins. People can use it to talk as a component of a theory of origins, but intelligent design is actually a theory of causation. It's about what all does actually count as a cause. And so if you are a thoroughgoing materialist, well, you only have one kind of cause to choose from, and it has to be some form of material causation. And so, as a Christian, I obviously don't think that that's true. Now, you can not think that's true for other reasons as well, but that's one of the things that Christianity does. Is Christianity can at least say, okay, well, I have a prior reason for thinking that that's not true, and therefore I'm going to go look and see what the alternatives are. So basically, what intelligent design says is that basically intelligent causation is its own form of a cause. It can't be reduced to a material mechanism. Because a lot of people say, well, how does intelligent design work? Like, tell me the mechanism. Like, well, that's actually counter to what intelligent design is doing. Intelligent design is talking about a mode of causation that isn't materialistic. And so that's really what's the defining factor of intelligent design, is whether or not this mode of causation actually exists, if it's real, if it can be examined and quantified and that sort of thing. But it's a lot easier to see if you are predisposed to see it. And I can see that if you were a materialist and you just didn't think that other types of causes existed or were even meaningful, then you might not be able to really see how intelligent design is operating.
Okay, great. Yeah. And by the way, folks, for those watching the video, I'm in a new place right now and I'm experimenting with, I'm realizing this lighting setup is making it look like I'm Two-Face. And so, and maybe that's like a metaphor that I'm like trying to straddle between Christianity and science or something. But anyway, I'll try to tinker with this in future episodes to get the balance better. But I don't know if you like this, John. And again, don't worry, folks, we're going to get into the meat of this in just a moment. But what I don't want to have happen, Jonathan, is like some people who aren't Christians, who are interested in evolution, whatever, to hear you say, just think that you're ultimately going to be like, you need Jesus and da-da-da, and then I don't need to hear this. Where I'm saying, even if you don't believe in the Bible,
right,
there are serious problems with the standard Darwinian explanation of things that you can use information science to see. And people who happen to be Christian, I think, are better equipped to immediately see the problem.
Right. No, that's exactly correct. I forgot where I was going.
Well, heaven.
Yeah. No. So, how did you start? You started saying
that you don't have to be a Christian to see the problems, but it helps if you are.
Yeah. So, So I am probably the world's worst evangelist. So if you're worried that I'm going to come up here and evangelize you,
Christopher Hitchens was pretty bad.
Well, there's one of the four, Sam Harris. I actually thought he was a great evangelist for deism. Mm-hmm. He actually he says he's for atheism, but if you actually dig down deep, his theology or his ideas only make sense under deism, not really atheism. But nonetheless, I'm not here to preach at anybody, because it's really it's one of those things. It's probably a problem on my side. I probably should be preaching to you, but I'm really terrible at it. So,
Well, why don't
but
we, if I could jump it, so can you just elaborate a little bit? 'Cause for, again, to distinguish
mhm,
between these, a lot of people think that intelligent design is the same thing as biblical creationism, or as
right.
creationism as a Trojan horse, and you're just trying to dress it up. But basically, you believe in the Genesis account, and so can you
Yeah.
comment on
So
that?
yeah. So now, first of all, I want to say that there are people who use intelligent design in that way. So I that there, that's the fact, and that's unfortunate because that isn't what intelligent design is. So as I mentioned, intelligent design is more of a theory of causation. What sort of causes are there? And so when people, so people think about intelligent design against Darwinian evolution, and so that's true, but I view that as more of an application area rather than the theory itself. And but the problem is that when you argue against Darwinian evolution, people think that that means that you are against evolution as a whole, and that's actually not the case. What intelligent design is doing is saying what sort of causes are required to actually perform some given action. Say, so we look at something and we say, okay, well, you know, this, it's like saying, if for something to catch on fire, there had to have been enough thermodynamic energy to do that, right? And so you're saying there's a causal necessity, there's something that needs explanation for that to have happened. And so in intelligent design, we say, well, when we have things that are like highly informational, when we have these things that work in a semantic manner and not just in a physical manner, well, these things require a type of cause that isn't really readily available in Darwinian evolution. That's why a lot of people say, well, you use Darwinian as a pejorative, and really it's not the case. We're using the word Darwinian to be specific about the type of evolution that we're objecting to. So to give an example, because there's a lot of different ways that evolution might work. A lot of people have been, we've kind of had this one idea about what evolution is ingrained in us. So that's the only way that people think about it working. But
Can I stop you just
yeah,
to clarify? So, what you're making a distinction, you're saying it's not that you're opposed to the idea of evolution or the concept, or what it's specifically Darwinian evolution, that what people mean by that more specific phrase, that you're saying that by itself does not
correct.
have the explanatory power to
Yeah,
get the job done.
yeah. You wind up with a combinatorial explosion that is just not solvable.
Okay.
So let me give you an example of a way that evolution could happen that is not contrary to the ideas of intelligent design.
Okay.
So when you install an operating system on your computer, right? You have a single disk that's the installer, right? And then once it's installed, you go on your computer and you find all these different programs. You find Notepad, WordPad, the system settings, the Finder. All these different programs are on your computer. These separate, different programs, and so, but all of them actually had their origin in this one master program, the installer. And so you could say that there was a common descent between the installation program and all the programs that wound up on your computer. And so it was a program, and that program was a common ancestor of all those programs. But it would be incorrect to say that that all happened by random mutation and natural selection. What happened is the installer contained sufficient information to create all of the programs that are on your computer. Now, the installer didn't have all the information stored in the same way as the other programs on your computer. And it may have done things like sensed the environment that your computer is being installed into and written some configuration files. There's all sorts of things that it could have that it can do, and has transformed the information that it started with. But ultimately, it started out as a single program that had sufficient information for the rest of the evolution, as it were, to take place into the programs that you have now.
Can,
Another,
can I
yeah,
stop you there again? So and sorry, Jonathan, that I ran this by you before we recorded, but I think it's helpful for the audience too, because I said that this was a big moment of aha for me when I was getting into this literature. So again, folks, Jonathan's making the distinction between the standard, I guess what they call it now, neo-Darwinian or Darwinian, like grand synthesis of
the modern synthesis is probably the most technical term for it.
That explanation, one could find that lacking and believe and endorse and say, oh no, I like this intelligent design or ID, this movement or whatever you want to call it. And you could still be an ID proponent and believe in common descent, or the theory of common descent, let's say, because it's a theory. And so specifically, again, just trying to make these distinctions to understand what the claim is. Also, just Jonathan, when I was at Hillsdale as a professor, they had a conference on intelligent design, and I could just tell both sides were talking past each other. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I'm biased. I think it was more the standard, biology professors who believed in the, modern synthesis. They were not really listening to what they were showing up, what they thought was evidence for and not realizing, no, this is entirely consistent with, what the ID guy was saying. It doesn't, hurt his case at all.
Exactly.
And so, like I said, the moment for me was when his name's William Dembski. Yeah, William Dembski. He had this offhand remark in one of his books or something, I think I was reading, saying that Michael Behe, who is the guy who really goes into the bacterial flagellum, I think, and hey, look, if you go ahead and zoom in these things with an electron microscope, I mean, there's an outboard motor on these things, just showing how even individual cells from relatively simple creatures are surprisingly complicated. And it's if you just took one piece away, the whole thing wouldn't work. It's not, it's hard to see how you could just even get that simple single-celled organism to arise step by step, with each change conferring an advantage. And Dembski said, as far as I know, Behe is fine with the theory of common descent. So he thinks every organism on Earth right now, ultimately you could trace back to some supercell that they all were derived from, or, that it was their ancestor. And he said, it's just that first cell must have had a lot of information packed into it that you just can't say, oh, lightning hit a pond or something, and that's where that cell kit that. No, that just doesn't work if you understand like information science.
Right.
So
and Behe has said that since his very first book. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I can usually tell, because a lot of the people who are kind of the hardcore Darwinists who are heavy anti-ID, you can tell that they've never read Behe at all, because they usually consider him to be a special creationist. So, and you're like, well, if you read anything because he says this in, I think, almost every book, he says that he is fine with common descent. Mm-hmm. So if you've literally written anything that he has written, then you would know that just isn't the case.
And so, I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but that's why it's so frustrating when I watch these debates, because there was a period, again, when I was a professor at Hillsdale, I really got into this stuff. And, 15, 20 hours a week for a period there where that's all I was reading was this stuff. And that was so frustrating because a lot of the standard, Darwinian defenders, they kept offering all this evidence. Like, look at the fossils and look at this and all just showing that, hey, we have very good reason to believe that, there's a nested hierarchy and you could just go back and everything's branch. And I was like, yes, that's all perfectly consistent with the standard ID framework. Again, so, all right, I'll stop beating that horse.
Yeah. So that's 100% true. I see that happen all the time. So let me again propose yet another version of evolution that would be consistent with intelligent design. So in the first instance, we have, everything came from a single ancestor, but that ancestor had sufficient information to cause the generation of life as we know it. Another one would be that at the origin of life, that there was an immaterial, that the origin of life, I believe that we have something like a soul. I don't know if soul is the exact thing to describe it, but something that is non-material about human beings. Well, if something non-material was, in the first living thing, it could have. This was actually kind of the old pre-Darwinian view. The Lamarck, I think this was Lamarck's view. I haven't done a lot of, a historian of science might be able to tell me that I'm wrong here, but some in the pre-Darwinian view, it was the idea that these organisms had an end goal that they were driving to, and so you could have this diversification because there was an internal drive that was not a material mechanism, but it was part of the nature of the organism to drive, to change, to become. And so anyway, so another form of evolution that would be compatible with ID theory would be the idea that organisms evolve because of basically the technical term for this is teleology. So they have an internal teleology that is driving them towards a goal. And so that's another way that you can have evolution. Now you can also, intelligent design is also compatible with disagreeing with evolution, because you might say, well, maybe God put at different times or different places, different organisms had made separate creations, and that's intelligent design does not sit is about what is causally what sort of causes are good enough to work the effect. And so if the so you can intelligent design is not about this specific life history event. It's about is some proposed life history event compatible with what we know from information theory? Is it compatible with what we know from these other ideas? Does it have enough causal efficacy to achieve the result it's saying that it does? Mm-hmm. And that's what intelligent design focuses on, is a question of, did you propose sufficient causes for the effect that you're seeing?
Okay, let me stop you again. I think now that we've been stressing so much, here's what the ID people are saying. Let me flip and just recapitulate, the standard thing you'd get in a mainstream biology course or whatever, just to make sure the listeners are understanding this clash now that we're setting up here. So in standard biology, now the way it's taught and whatever, they will stress that, hey, don't fall into the trap. You might be thinking like, oh, billions of years ago, there was, the first primitive life forms, and then they went this, and they got more complicated. And it was all this grand thing, like leading up to, the emergence of Homo sapiens and, everything. And they say, no, don't think of it like that. Modern, the bacteria on your kitchen counter are just as evolved as you are. It's not that you're more sophisticated, no, they can survive, and they have survived the evolutionary test just as much as you have. They do it through different means and whatnot. And evolution is blind, it's unguided. And the way it works, the mechanism is that when organisms reproduce, every once in a while, it's rare, there's a mutation. And so they don't make a perfect copy of, the DNA or whatever we're talking about, RNA and such. And most of the times those mutations are harmful, that does not confer an advantage, and those things die off very quickly and don't reproduce. But once in a great while, the mutation actually is advantageous. And again, what do you mean advantageous? From the perspective of the genes making more copies of themselves. That's what we mean. And then those tend to be more prevalent in succeeding generations, and then eventually, and that just keeps happening. And given a long enough time frame, billions of years to work with, that simple blind, pointless. There's no goal. There's no entity, hoping to achieve something through these means. Nope, none of that. And out the other end, there's Homo sapiens walking around, and people, you got your eyeballs and your heart and your circulatory system, and that it was step by step. And just because you can't imagine how that could have arisen by a series of blind, incremental steps, that's no strike against my theory. That just your lack of imagination is no strike against my explanation. Thank you. Okay, so that's remember, that's the foil. And I'm not. Are you okay with that, Jonathan? I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth.
So one thing I want to correct on that, or I don't even know if it's correction, but I don't like to say standard view because
Okay, fair enough.
a lot of people will say, well, the standard view isn't Darwinian anymore, and if that's correct, that's great. That's fantastic. I
Yeah,
love that.
fair
That means
enough. Yeah.
it's more in line with intelligent design. Now, but usually when people say that, really, if you pull back the covers a little bit, they really mean, yes, it's the Darwinian view, but I don't like to say so. So there's a little bit of that. But yeah, the modern synthesis view is that mutations are accidental, that there was not a mechanism that was geared towards their generation. And then selection is about whether or not the organisms as they are now either reproduce more or die more. And there isn't any forethought, there isn't any looking to what this mutation might give us in the future. There's no intentionality whatsoever. It's just the mutations happen for no reason, and selection happens just because of the mutations and the environment that they're in, and not anything about the future. So that's kind of the standard view of the modern synthesis. So and hopefully that's changing. I actually see some evidence that it's changing, and people don't want to actually say that it's changing, because that actually is a big career killer if you stand too far against the modern synthesis.
Well, that was something I was going to ask you. It sounds like you got your finger to the pulse of this. Certainly back when I was hip deep in this stuff, like between 2003 and 2006, that's when that's when I was a professor at Hillsdale. It was clearly career suicide for a biology professor to be talking about this stuff. I mean, if you were tenured, they couldn't get rid of you, but definitely, your colleagues would think, oh, okay, he's one of those ID people. All right, Bible thumper. And again, folks, it's not merely at the time, so maybe things have simmered down since then, but at the time, John, and I'm sure if you were into it back then too, it wasn't merely that the defenders of the orthodox view, let's call it at the time, that they were just saying, oh, I disagree with what you're saying, and no, they were saying what you're talking about is not science. Like please, students and faculty, do not fall for the siren song of the so-called ID, which is this, creationism is a Trojan horse, because it's not just that they're wrong, it's that the stuff they're saying is the idea of an intelligence when you come to looking at biological structures, that's like saying, oh, that's thundering because the gods are playing or bowling or something like that's the way they were trying to make it. And I'll just one more thing, Jonathan, and I'll turn over. My response would be like, okay, so if it did turn out, just it could be that humans are here because aliens from another galaxy 1 billion years ago came and planted a seeded Earth with an SEED, not CEDE, seeded Earth with some thing that they just developed in the lab. And you're saying science could never teach us that, because to even go down that path and say, it almost looks like we were designed by alien would be unscientific. And so we could just never know that. And so we better hope that that's not what happened, because now we can never know, ever, no matter how much evidence. We could find tapes of the aliens, doing it and telling us that they buried in a mountain somewhere or something. And nope, we just said, oh, no, I'm not listening. The priests could get up on Sunday and tell us where we came from, but no scientist would be allowed to talk. Oh, because that would be unscientific. Anyway. And then too, like with the COVID-19 thing, it was hilarious, where people were worrying about, was it made in a lab? And some of us who remember those debates were like emailing me and saying, "Oh God, Bob, these guys are being unscientific. They're wondering if COVID-19." Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, I wrote an article about that, because there was if you remember, they actually did a paper early on about how it couldn't have been made in the lab. And they went through and said, well, here's how you would make it in a lab. It obviously doesn't match these things, therefore it was not designed in a lab. And so I wrote an article. I was like, if you all had spent 5 minutes taking any heed of what the ID movement says, you would know that you can only rule in design. You actually technically can't rule it out. Because you can always someone can do something intentionally to seem random.
Right.
So you actually can't rule something out as design. You can only rule it in. And therefore, the conclusion, I don't have any personal knowledge either way as to whether or not COVID-19 was done in a lab or not. I honestly, it's not something that affects me one way or the other. But I could see that they actually didn't have the technical knowledge to know how to make a proper design inference because they've been ignoring us. When we actually have gone through the process of saying, what does a design inference look like? What does it mean? What are the limitations of it? What can you do with it? These are things that we've been discussing in the ID community for years. And so when the science all of a sudden needs to do a design inference, they don't know the framework for it. And so they kind of left themselves out. But one of the things I wanted to also mention, because it's actually pretty funny, you talk about how career killing it is to be an ID, and there is somewhat of a sea change, and it's kind of a funny overlap because there are definitely places where it's still a career killer, but there's also places where there's some sort of homage being paid to the old guard. But like there's a paper, there's an ID paper published in the Journal of Theoretical Biology a couple of years ago, and shortly after it was published, there was a big hubbub, and so Journal of Theoretical Biology was forced to publish a note that said something to the effect of, "Oh gosh, we didn't realize these people were ID. If we'd realized that these were ID people, we wouldn't have published the paper. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry." Well, what's hilarious is that like 6 to 9 months later, they published another ID paper by the same people, and then published the same, "Oh, gee, oh, I'm sorry, oh, I didn't know," note attached to it. So it's like they're just they're gonna publish it, but then they're gonna apologize, and so they're gonna pretend like they're gonna do the dance, they're gonna say the words, do the dance, but at the end of the day, they're gonna allow it to be published, and that seems to be.
Do we know? Was it the same editorial staff?
I mean, it was the same journal.
Okay.
So I don't know if it was handled by the same editor or not, but nonetheless, I mean, if I remember correctly,
the journal's contents are intelligently chosen. That's just not just.
If I remember correctly, they didn't even write a new note; they just linked to the old one.
Whoa, that's weird.
Yes, it was.
What the heck?
Yeah, well, I think it was their signal to everyone else. That's like, is like, okay, we'll kowtow to you as far as saying we're sorry, but we're not. It's sorry, not sorry. And so
maybe I understand. Wait, so it wasn't that the first note said, "Gosh, we wouldn't have." Was it more just like, we are aware that there are strong misgivings and we don't agree with a lot of what the ID movement says. Nevertheless, we felt this particular paper met the merits. No,
they said. Well, I don't remember the exact words of it, but if I remember correctly, it was something to the effect of, we wouldn't have published this if we would have known. Okay. It's like oh, I didn't know. Who knew there was gambling in this establishment?
Right.
That sort of thing. And when it happens multiple times and you say the exact same thing every time, you're like, well, maybe it's just for show.
But even linking to the last time you said, I had no idea. That's what I'm why I recoiled and thought maybe I'm misunderstanding the situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, they literally like, oh yeah, just refer to my statement last time when you find gambling in this establishment. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, yeah, because I think it probably would simmer down because I've noticed more and more scientists, like public intellectual types, are a lot freer on podcasts. It's partly probably because the rise of podcasts and things are getting more loosey-goosey and whatever, that they're saying things. I'm not talking about like ID. I just mean like if you saw some guy on Joe Rogan, so some PhD in, I don't know, let's say biology on Joe Rogan's show, and he's in MIT or something, and he was talking about like telekinesis. Like he wouldn't necessarily be ruined, especially if he sounded real sharp and like was using jargon and stuff. Whereas I think 20 years ago, people would be like, "What are you, crazy?" And so anyway, I just think that people are more open now to the fact that the world is a lot more complicated and there's lots of energy flows in man and all this stuff. And, reputable scientists can talk about things that would have been hippy dippy 20 years ago.
There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
Exactly. So what do you think we should give more preamble or just jump into your papers at this point?
Yeah, let's jump in. I want probably the best one to jump into is the one about random with respect to fitness or external selection.
Yeah. So the official title is "Random with Respect to Fitness or External Selection?" ? An important but often overlooked distinction. Okay.
Yeah.
And so where was this published?
So it's a theoretical biology journal called Acta Biotheoretica.
Okay.
And it's I forget where it's published out of. It's somewhere in Europe. I think it's Nordic.
How about Fantasyland? That was my Rodney Dangerfield.
Nice. Yeah, and so this paper, kind of what I'm doing here is I'm challenging the notion that mutations are accidental.
Okay.
Because we're growing up, told, and this is what happens. Like, when in my time in the creation movement, everyone kind of took the assumption from the modern synthesis that mutations were random. They just said, "Oh, I'm going to take that as yeah."
Yeah,
well,
it's sort of like the phrase "random mutations," almost like a pleonasm, sort of like on Seinfeld. It's like it's an innocent bystander. It's by definition, a bystander is innocent.
Right. Exactly. And I think part of it is everyone just assumed that there was experimental evidence for this. They assumed that who would make such an assertion if you didn't have the data on your side, right? And it's not that there wasn't any data, but the data didn't actually point to what they thought it did, and it was not nearly as strong as they thought it was. And so everyone kind of it's one of those things, if you think about bacteria, when they first discovered bacteria, they discovered it basically by the fact that it made people sick, right? That's kind of how they were able. They traced diseases, and for a while, we were kind of germophobic. We're like, oh, well, if we get rid of the bacteria, then we'll get rid of all of the bad things, and so we need to get rid of all of the bacteria because all the bacteria is bad,
right? And the witches too. That's important.
Yes. But then they figured out, what actually the case is that most of the bacteria is actually good for you. You actually cause problems if you get rid of all the bacteria. But what was the case was that we were, at the
Can
low
I stop
level
real fast?
Yeah.
And that's why, right? Like, if you're taking antibiotics because you got like an ear infection or something, like you might have diarrhea while you're doing it. Like it's messing with the good bacteria in your gut, that sort of thing.
And you're supposed to eat yogurt and replenish that stuff. And although I don't know how well that works, but yeah, that's the idea behind it.
You take the antibiotics and the probiotics to get the same amount of biotics. That's
exactly.
what you do.
Exactly.
I don't know why the yogurt doesn't help the thing that's hurting my ear, but anyway.
You wind up with just amateur biotics at that point.
Yeah.
So, so what it was is that, at the level of technology we were at when we found bacteria, is that we could only really trace bacteria when it did something bad. That's the only way we could really figure out what it was doing was when it was doing something bad. And likewise, before we had like whole genome sequencing and that sort of thing, we really could only trace mutations when they did something pretty terrible. It actually took a lot of it took a lot more research to figure out when they weren't doing something terrible, or so there were whole classes of mutations that just weren't even thought of because we didn't have the technology to really look at them. But in modern times, we're able to discern the mechanisms of mutations more and more, and we're realizing that the modern synthesis view of mutations is just wrong. I don't want to give people the impression that your body knows exactly what mutation to produce, right? So it isn't the case that this happens and therefore your body produces the exact mutation at the exact right time every time. right? But the way to think about it is that let's say that you bury a treasure. Let's say that you have a building that has 1,000 floors and 1,000 rooms on each floor, and somebody has put the treasure in one of those rooms. Okay, so so if I were to search each of those rooms, I'd have to search 1,000,000 rooms. But if someone said, you know what, the treasure's on the 850th floor, well, then I only have to search 1,000 rooms, right? So I'm still not getting the treasure every time I search, but I'm a lot more likely to than I would have if I had to search every room.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the nature of the guidance. And that's also part of the reason why it wasn't found earlier, is because it was just assumed that since sometimes it didn't find the right answer, that it must not be actually looking for the right answer. And so people took the idea that the fact that cells aren't omniscient as evidence that it's just groping at straws, but it actually turns out to be much more subtle than that. So just to give a simple example, there's a bacteria called Neisseria, and this bacteria has an outer coat gene called pilin. And so basically what it has is it has one gene for the pilin, but it also has 20-something pseudogenes that have alternate versions of that gene. Okay. Now, I don't know if you remember back in the day, but they used to say that, we might not know what use of all of the non-coding DNA is, but we know for sure that the pseudogenes are junk, right? But it turns out in this case, bacteria are using pseudogenes to store alternate versions of a gene. And so basically what happens is you have this recombination mechanism, which will copy from a pseudogene into the main gene, the DNA sequence. So it's literally mutating itself based on specific DNA sequences elsewhere and saying, okay, well, we're going to take this part, take this pseudogene and copy it into the main gene. And so that way, because it's always going from a pseudogene to the main gene, you're never losing your information because you always have the alternate copies. You're just changing out which one is the main copy. And so,
can I hang on a second, please?
Yeah.
That happens when the cell reproduces, or a given cell's just sitting there and it does the swap, and the same organism now is running around with the pseudogene now in the driver's seat.
I believe it does it when it reproduces.
Okay, so the parent organism always had the regular gene in the driver's seat and the pseudogene not doing anything. It makes a copy of itself, and that's when the swap happens. And now
I believe
that
that's
descendant.
Well, let's see. This is I'm actually not sure. I'm actually not sure exactly when that happens. Because sometimes bacteria will do mutations. Because the nice thing about Neisseria and actually all single-celled organisms is that in multicellular organisms, the problem is that when you have a mutation, you have to figure out, even if you have a way for the mutation to do something beneficial in the organism, it has to find its way back to the germline, and so you have to, if you're going to say that something was directed in an evolutionary sense, you would have to both find the mechanism that the mutation came about and find the mechanism that it came to be in the germline. The nice thing about single-celled organisms is that when you have a mutation in a single-celled organism, since there's only one cell, it is the germline. So if you have a mutation in that cell, then you don't have to trace it again; it's already there. So you just have the mutation, and then it is then inherited by its offspring. So an example of mutations that are really interesting that happen that are not necessarily since they're in multicellular organisms, they're not necessarily inheritable, but they are directed mutations. Is is in your antibodies. And so first of all, the way that you generate antibodies is amazing. You actually have basically you have different parts of a gene that get recombined into an antibody, an immunoglobulin. So basically, it's called VDJ recombination. So there's basically three buckets: a V bucket, a D bucket, and a J bucket. And those get a piece from each bucket gets pasted together, and that's your new antibody. There's also another region called the C region, but let's just think about it in this term. And so basically, your cell has just a whole line of V buckets, a whole line of D buckets, a whole line of J buckets, and it's got spacer elements between them so that the cell can tell where it needs to cut and paste. So it's got the specific sequence that says here's where to cut, and then it's got another system that tells how to make sure you don't accidentally join the wrong thing to the wrong thing. And so it basically cuts and pastes. So and the thing that's really nice about this is you get a combinatorial effect. So if I had these aren't the actual numbers, but if I had 10 V genes, 10 D genes, and 10 J genes, well, then I would have what is that? 1,000 different immunoglobulins just from 30 genes, from 30 gene parts. So you have this combinatorial explosion that works in your benefit. But that's not even the cool part. The nice thing is that if you have an antigen that comes in and you don't have an antibody that matches, well, your body will do what's called somatic hypermutation. And what that does is it basically causes your immune cells to hypermutate. That means mutate really fast until it finds an antibody that matches. Now, what's even better about this is that if your immune system just mutated any gene at random, that wouldn't be helpful, because if it mutated any gene at random, well, the genes that do sugar metabolism don't really help. Mutating them won't help you much. It's usually just a short jump from one of your existing immunoglobulin genes. So it restricts the mutations in this somatic hypermutation. It restricts the mutations to just the immunoglobulin genes. But not only that, there's actually kind of two parts to an immunoglobulin gene. There's one part that kind of sticks to the antigen, and one part that kind of signals to the immune system that says, hey, look over here. And so if you mutated the part that said, hey, over here, it wouldn't, then no matter what happened, it wouldn't be effective because it couldn't signal the rest of the immune system. And so it turns out that all the mutations happen, at least almost all the mutations, you can almost never say all in biology. So anytime you hear me say all, I mean almost all. So all the mutations happen in the part that sticks to the antigen. And so it's not that the cell knows what the mutation, which specific mutation it should do, right? It knows which general class of mutation it should do. And that greatly restricts the number of mutations. If you think about, hey, I previously had 3 billion base pairs to look through. Now I have a few thousand. That's a very big difference, especially if you think about how the search space, it's basically a combinatorial explosion when you have to have more than one mutation.
Okay, so is this right? Obviously, and by the way, back during the lockdowns and whatever, I was when they were working on the Operation Warp Speed or whatever, and I started reading, and I was fascinated by how complex the immune system was, and it almost looked like there was way more involved than I would have guessed. I mean, I guess that's not surprising in retrospect, but just all the different things that your body does. And then how does it remember? Well, once you gain immunity to something, like what does that mean? And so, yeah, so that was interesting. But clearly, standard biologists are familiar with what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, yeah, that doesn't make me think that, that Darwin was wrong or something. So are you saying, look, everybody, this distinction I'm trying to make between random mutation and selective mutation or restricted class of mutation, you already know that distinction because that's what goes on in the immune system. We all know this is standard stuff. And now I, Jonathan Bartlett, am just saying, take that distinction now and be cognizant of that and remember it. Let's now turn to the broader, explanation or framework by which we try to explain the origin of the species. And, why do you just assume that's got to be a random mutation? We've already just seen that not all mutations that happen in nature are, quote, random in that sense.
Right. And that's a good point. Yeah. It's kind of, because everybody seems to they seem to agree with the theory of random mutation, but then, we'll kind of push everything else, even if it really looks very different from random mutation, into that bucket. Mm-hmm. And you're like, no, there really are at least two different buckets here. There's mutations that are actually haphazard, that occurred because you got exposed to too much sun and your body broke down and that, but there's a whole other class of mutations that you can't call them random with respect to fitness because they really aren't. And I think part of the problem is, a lot of the people looking at this don't really think about what is the mathematics of what that means. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be directed? Because what happened is a lot of this got papered over by saying, okay, well, the rate of mutation changes, right? So if an organism's stressed, it might increase the rate of mutation. And then they say, okay, well, it might increase the rate of mutation at certain spots. But once you hit increase the rate of mutation at certain spots, you have to ask yourself, how is that possible? So let me go one further. They might increase mutation at certain spots that might be more likely to help the organism survive, right? Once you hit that level, how is that different from it no longer being random with respect to fitness? Because the idea behind random with respect to fitness was that there was nothing governing which mutations occurred. But if the mutations are increasing in rate at a site that is more likely to be beneficial, there needs to be some actual recognition of the fact that this is not the same thing as the random with respect to fitness. The other thing that a lot of people do is they'll say, yes, we know that there are mutational hotspots. This has always been known, and it's true that it's always been known that there are mutational hotspots. But random with respect to fitness means that the hotspots were not supposed to be they were not supposed to correspond to biophysical fitness. Right. That they were supposed to just be it just so happened that this spot mm-hmm. was more mutationally active than this other spot because this specific sequence was a little bit more likely to be mutated at random, maybe more sensitive to UV rays, something like that. Not that that it was not supposed to be the case that this was coded in such a way so that when something happens that means that this needs to be changed, that it would be changed. So there's the whole point of random with respect to fitness was that the need of the organism was not supposed to be any factor of the question of mutation. And so the first
can I stop you? Just because I'm tracking out with what you're saying. This distinction, it's dawning on me what you're really doing in this paper. So let me say this. It may help some listeners, or if you tell me no, that's not it. So right, like somebody who lived near the Chernobyl accident, maybe 20 years down the road, like has super hearing. And someone's like, what the heck is that? Or their kids have super hearing. And someone's like, what's that? And they say, oh, it's because of a random mutation based, on the radiation they got from that Chernobyl accident. And did something in the inner ear, and we're looking at that, and that's why their kids, have off the charts hearing ability. And then if somebody said, "What do you mean random mutation?" No, it wasn't random. It was because they lived down the street from that nuclear plant. That's not nothing random about that. Everybody know. And you would say, okay, sure, yeah. It's not that it randomly hit them instead of somebody who lived in Chicago. What we mean is it wasn't a mutation that was in some way that we would have thought would have anything to do with hearing. Like that.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Chernobyl was not oriented towards giving somebody hearing.
right. So that's.
Yeah.
So in that example, like everybody gets without a moment's further reflection, like, yeah, when we say random, we don't mean like science can't explain it. Like, yeah, there's always a specific cause of something, absent getting down to the quantum level. Sure. Yeah. That in biology, when we talk about a random mutation as an explanation for, some adaptation of, some more evolutionarily fit adaptation, we mean that the mutation was not like looking ahead. There wasn't some guiding process involved. And so if they say that though, then you're saying, well, wait a minute, what's going on with the immune system? Like, isn't that, and so you're realizing that standard, I don't know, shibboleth is the word I want. That's actually not a very secure foundation, even though in other contexts, it sounds like, yeah, of course, that's what we mean by random.
Exactly. And this happens quite a bit. And the amount that modern people who are trying to defend the modern synthesis are trying to kind of play with words to paper over this. I mean, that really lends me to think that they are actively trying to hold on to a worldview about what mutations mean, rather than actually trying to make good distinctions that are helpful scientifically. So, for example,
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Some people will say, well, if the mutation, if a beneficial mutation occurs less than 50% of the time, then we can call it random. And it's like, well, no. The raw percentage actually is irrelevant. First of all, if you imagine predators, there are predators who are not 50% successful at catching their prey. So we wouldn't say that they are don't have the end goal of catching their prey just because they're less than 50% capable of doing so. And likewise, with my example with the building with the 1,000,000 rooms, when we knew what floor it was, that was a lot of information, even though our chances of finding the treasure was still 1 in 1,000. So the raw percentage doesn't matter. What matters is the amount of kind of assistance that you get in discovering where the treasure actually is. And the nice thing is that that's quantifiable. That's in my other paper, but I don't quite want to get to it yet, because I just wanted to talk about some other things. Because what happens here?
Well, can I stop you 1 second? What's interesting is I think I can see where the proponent of, I know you don't want to use the standard view, the Darwinian synthesis view, modern synthesis view. I can see why they would hear our discussion thus far and think, okay, yeah, that's a clever little cul-de-sac you went down there, Mr. Bartlett. But I think they would say something like this, or I could imagine. What happened is that over the course of human evolution, or maybe the immune system was, inherited from some earlier thing. There were genuinely, random mutations, and some people, whenever they got sick, the cells in the in their arteries did mutate, and that didn't do anything, and so they all died off. And so it was just over time, random mutations that once in a while somebody's immune system, it just enhanced the mutations in those particular parts of the immune system that you focused on, and then those organisms tended to survive more. And so that's where this comes from. But you can't use that as so yes, that's an interesting little quirk that you pointed out. We got to be more careful, when we use sweeping generalizations. But clearly, to talk about, and the bacteria has the pseudo gene and it swapped it, all you're really doing is pushing the problem back. And ultimately, no, it had to have come from genuinely random with respect to fitness. Otherwise, where did it all come from? QED. And then, you would say, well,
Yeah,
that's our point. It must have come from something intelligent.
yeah,
And so I could see how you're almost
mhm,
both agreeing on the same conclusion. And they would just walk away saying this distinction you're raising isn't very
right.
interesting because, our explanation can't rely on that. That at best, that's just a detail you've thrown in, but still our explanation has to be random in the way we mean. Otherwise, we're just pushing the problem back. We haven't explained anything.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you just look at it on its face, um, you can hear the worldview seeping in,
Mm-hmm.
that because they're not saying that we have evidence that these mechanisms arose from random mutations. They're merely asserting it. And as we mentioned earlier, even if they bring up precursor mechanisms, we're not talking about whether or not they're precursor mechanisms. There may be precursor mechanisms. The question is whether or not you can use uh, basically non-informationally aware processes to get informationally aware processes. And so you would not only have to show that there were precursors, but that they were less informationally aware than the current ones, and that there was no other process that had information that contributed to it. So, if but the other thing though, so to begin with, there's kind of a worldview that's sneaking in there. Um, and what I would say is let's let go of the worldview for a little bit and just ask yourself if we keep on finding that the interesting mutations that we see today now are more and more coming from we're finding out that there's mechanisms that are guiding them. If we're finding that more and more about what's happening today, why would you look for other mechanisms? Like if that seems to be what causes the beneficial mutations today, why would you keep on going and say, well, it must be some other mechanism
Mm-hmm.
because I can't have it be I can't have that at the bottom. It can't be. Why not? Just from a pure empirical perspective, why not? Um, the the intelligent design movement has also come up with uh, kind of a combination. At its core, it's conservation of information theorems. But there's one in particular called the displacement theorem, which is really interesting, and it basically says that if you think about evolution as a search, and whether or not you think evolution is actually a search, it is at least mathematically a search, which is all that really matters for informational analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So if evolution is a search, and we know that we have a search that is able to find solutions with a certain frequency, and you say, okay, well, that didn't come about. There was another. You can think of the other one as a search process that found this search process. So you have a search for a search,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, the displacement theorem actually shows that the search for the search is harder, and even it, in most circumstances, orders of magnitude harder than the search itself. So if we think about so you think about this organism, and it needs, it needs an antibody, right? Well, finding the single antibody it needs is orders of magnitude easier than finding the system that finds antibodies. And so, therefore, you'd first of all need to be able to show that it could find, the thing that it's looking for at random in the first place, but also show, if something needs one antibody, why would it look in an orders of magnitude larger search space to find not why would it look, how could it why is it finding this needle in this giant haystack instead of the needle in the smaller haystack, and how is it doing that before dying? So that's kind of the intermediate question I would ask. And so that's kind of, and so basically what ID says is that you can push design back. That's fine. You can push design back as far and as long as you want. But the funny thing about design is when you push it back, it gets bigger. It doesn't get smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I always find it weird that people say, well, I have, they try to separate out origin of life and evolution, right? But what if I say, okay, well, what if you pushed everything back, if you pushed the design back, let's just say that all of it happened in the origin of life. Okay, so you had, instead of an information poor origin life, you had an information rich origin life. And then they're like, well, that can't happen. And like, tell me why not, without, you've said that you don't know how the origin of life happened. So tell me why the origin of life should be information poor and not information rich without using a particular theory of the origin of life. And that's where, it kind of breaks down. You then have to say something about what you imagine the origin of life to look like. And it turns out that, even though in theory, evolution is separable from origin of life, there's actually, in some important ways, the modern synthesis, at least, is based on certain presuppositions about what the origin of life has to look like.
Yeah, you said a lot there. I was tracking what you're saying, and this, what you're talking about their commentary, and again, we're putting words in their mouth, but it betraying a sort of the seeping in of their worldview, affecting things. So I'm understanding what you're saying, that now that we've nailed down this distinction, you've illuminated it between random mutation with respect to fitness versus mutation that in some way is narrowed or refined to promote fitness, or to increase the probability or something like, because it's not certain, like you said. Now that we have that distinction, and then if you just say empirically, let's just see in nature right now, what mechanism seems to be more prevalent, and I could see how a lot of modern would be like, what's the point? Who cares? Like, yeah, go ahead and do it. We're not going to say you can't do it. You're not allowed, but that's not going to affect me anyway, because I know if it turns out that even, 99.99% is what you're talking about, so what? That's not going to explain where life came from, because you said like most that's just pushing the problem back, and we know. So for us to have a satisfactory theory, we have to rely on the random, the genuinely random stuff. And so, but again, that's kind of just saying, right. So you guys are just admitting, you're not arriving at that conclusion because of empirical, induction from the facts. You kind of just say, well, if we're not willing to assume there's a supernatural creator or aliens or whatever, it's just got to be blind processes with the raw matter that we had to work with, 5 billion years ago, and that's it. Then okay, but you're kind of assuming at the outset what the answer has to look like. So don't be surprised when your reason and science, shoot out the answer at the other end that you assumed at the outset.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So one thing, I do want to, because it's in the title, I do want to fully explicate my title.
Sure.
So the random with respect to fitness versus external selection. The very narrow problem I was looking at was something can be, so if you imagine that there are certain parts of your, let's just imagine there's certain parts of your genome that you shouldn't touch, right? Mm-hmm. So if you protected those spots, but freely had random mutation in the other spots, you would be non-random with respect to fitness, but you might be random with respect to what was happening outside your body. So kind of this idea that there is a way that your body works with itself, kind of an inner coherence. And so the question of whether or not mutations have some amount of inner coherence is separate from the question of whether or not they are responding to things in the environment. Now, there's evidence of both of those happening, but the main gist of the paper was to point out that even the ones that that we don't know that they're triggered by the environment, that doesn't mean that they're random with respect to fitness, because fitness includes both the internal fitness of how my body works with itself and fitness with the environment, right? Fitness is both of those things. But if I have mutations that are, if mutations are more likely to occur in places where they're safer to occur, that already is not random with respect to fitness. It's only random with respect to external selection.
Because when you're saying safer, that's what you mean ultimately. Like, what do you mean safe?
Yeah. Right. That I'm not going to disrupt my internal biological processes. So things like metabolism. Metabolism is usually coming up with a different food source, that sort of thing. That's usually pretty safe. So dealing with the outer environment versus, how does this part of my body communicate with this part of my body? That's usually a little, or this, what are the internal housekeeping of the cell? Okay. That sort of thing. That's a little bit more dangerous to touch. But we know from experimental evidence that mutations are more likely to occur in the places that are safer. And so it is not random with respect to fitness. So we can't view mutations as just being haphazard. They're not accidents that happen to the cell. They're actually, in many cases, they're guided by the cell. If we had a lot of more time, I would tell you about some of the more interesting ones, because there's some that are like really, really cool how they work, but it's kind of biochemically involved. I'll give a reference for anyone who really wants to dive into it. There's I think it's called Hopping into a Hot Seat, and it's a really fascinating paper on not by someone who's in the ID movement, as far as I'm aware. Really fascinating paper on how this can happen, on how mutations can be directed by the environment. Anyway, and then another thing I want to mention from my paper is that this is not just mere definitions. Now, I sometimes like to argue over definitions because I think they're important generally, but there's more to it than just defining words and that sort of thing. There are actual areas of biology that are being modeled based on the idea that mutations are random. Mm-hmm. So one of the main ones being distribution of fitness effects. So what they do to try to figure out what the distribution of fitness effects of mutations are is they will assume that mutations are random, and then randomly mutate a protein, and then figure out what the effects of those mutations are. And then they will kind of assume that this spectra of contingencies is equivalent to the spectrum that happens in biology, because mutations are random with respect to fitness. And so there's good theoretical reasons that you can model random with respect to fitness with actual randomness, even though they aren't equivalent ideas. And so they aren't wrong that if they follow the modern synthesis, that would be a good approach to characterizing the distribution of fitness effects. But if mutations actually aren't random, then that isn't a good approach to characterizing the fitness effects of mutations. And so these ideas have downstream consequences that aren't always immediately obvious. And so that's one thing. It's one of the important parts of establishing a solid theoretical basis, is so that you have ideas, because there's never a time when you're doing science and you have all the information. That never happens. It doesn't happen. I'm not sure if it happens anywhere in life. Maybe quizzes in logic classes. That's kind of the only place where you actually have all the information you need. And so what happens in every other place is you substitute the information you don't have with theory, and your ideas about what the world should be like. And if your theory is wrong, if your core concepts are misguided, then some of these occur in very subtle ways, um, but your theory winds up filling in blanks um, that they shouldn't be filling in, or that should be filled in another way.
Right. Okay. Now, in that paper, do you guys get into, or do you get into like specific like empirical results, like to show, hey, this is actually relevant. I'm not just splitting hairs here.
So as I in the abstract, I say this distinction has important mathematical, experimental, and inferential implications. And I go through I go through all of those. I show how this actually affects the way that we look at mutations mathematically. It affects how we do experiments and how we make inferences. So I give specific examples of each one.
Okay, great. Well, what do you think? I know there was a second paper. Do you want to jump into that, or do you think we should not?
Let's do it briefly. So
okay.
So basically, because what the second paper did. So the first paper you can think of as a very narrow, restricted. Here are a very definitive definition. Here's and here are the implications. Mm-hmm. The other paper kind of covers in more broad spectrum everything we've talked
John,
about.
Let me read the title is of the second paper you're talking about now. Causal Capabilities of Teleology and Teleonomy in Life and Evolution.
Yes. So this second paper covers a lot of the other things that we've been talking about. So everything every side trail that you and I have covered today is kind of wrapped up in this paper. Okay. So kind of how the question of what is a beneficial mutation? How do you measure them? That's one thing that's covered in the paper is how do you measure how goal directed a mutation is? And so that's in the paper. What does this mean for pushing back design, pushing back teleology?
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but it's fascinating this because before you and I had this conversation, if you had said, how do you measure how goal-directed a mutation is, I would have said, isn't the answer 0, like by construction?
Exactly.
And yet your point is no, it shouldn't be.
Right. Or we could, maybe it is, and if we measure it, we'll get 0.
But I said by construction. That's the part where we say it shouldn't be by construction. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And for someone who's worried about it, I did not set up the question of the measurement so that I'd always get a positive value or something. It can give positive values for, yes, it gave information to help you. It could give a 0 value that said that there was no information provided. It can even give a negative value that says not only did it not give you information, it pointed you in the wrong direction. Anyway, so there's how do you quantify that? There's what is the kind of the larger scope? What does this mean? There's a term teleonomy that I should take a moment to explain, which is basically if I teleonomy is, so we talked about teleology being kind of end goals, goal directedness, purpose. Teleonomy is teleology that is due to a code. So the reason why it was developed was because they thought, well, organisms look like they're behaving because of a purpose, but it's not a real purpose because it was actually the code, and the code came from evolution, and evolution didn't have a purpose, but they are behaving according to a purpose because of their code, and they invented the term teleonomy to describe that. Well, the interesting thing is I found that teleonomy, even though it was invented kind of as a way of helping out the modern synthesis, I actually think it's actually a hugely useful term, because I think there are things where things act according to purposes because of codes. That there's a lot in the biochemistry that where the purposes of maintaining homeostasis is being acted on because of codes. The codes are doing all this.
Can I stop you? Just again, this is because you hear that a lot and you sort of take it for granted, but there is a rigorous sense in which a bacterium is governed by a code, whereas a rock is not.
Right.
Like it's like we speak like that, but I'm saying, so what does that mean? Like it's not
Yeah. So,
everything. If you scanned it fine enough to tell it, they're all just like atoms obeying the laws of physics. So what exactly do
yeah.
we mean that there's a code involved with this with
Yeah.
the
So
bacterium?
I go into kind of a detailed definition in the paper. I'll see if I can summarize it quickly. The way to think about it is this: like so there's another term called teleomatic that was developed. That means it went to its end because of physics. Like, and this is kind of a long-standing philosophical question of whether or not the laws of physics are themselves should be classified themselves as a form of teleology. And so they came up with this term teleomatic to kind of give philosophers their due, but to say, well, it is the laws of physics, not so to give an example, if I drop a bomb and just like a World War II style bomb, well, from the time I let go of the bomb to the time that it hits, that's teleomatic, because it's the laws of physics governing it all the way down. Okay. Now there's some amount of ambiguity. You can chalk it up to quantum indeterminacy, or maybe even just our intractability of computation, where there's a scope where you're not sure where that bomb's going to land. Is it going to land here? Is it going to land here? Is it going to land over there? Where there's some sort of, but you can say within this range, it's going to land, and I can know that because of teleomatics. Now let's say that I dropped a smart bomb and that it was, say, a heat-seeking source. Well, if I drop this bomb and I know that there's a heat source down here, I don't have to trace all of the microstates of the bomb to know that it's going to hit the heat source, right? I can have a really good idea by knowing the logic that's in the bomb. If I know the logic that it's programmed by, and I kind of know the purposes to which the logic is programmed, then I can have a pretty good idea of where the bomb's going to land without having to go through every physical microstate that it goes through. Even if there's like a wide area that maybe the bomb could go within a mile radius, but I know because of its control mechanism that it's going to go for the heat source, and so therefore I know there's a code there. It doesn't have to actually be computer code. It could be a mechanism. It could be some sort of I'm terrible with mechanisms myself, so I can't even give you an example because I do software, not hardware. So people get scared if I hold a wrench. It's bad news for everybody. So whether it's an actual code or just some sort of mechanical system, if there's some sort of a control system, well, that's guidance, and that's teleonomy, because there's a physical system that's implementing something that's governing towards a goal. And goals themselves, there's a philosophical question of what constitutes a goal. Cover that in the paper as well. But once you've established something as a goal, you can then reason in terms of that goal. So that's kind of where that lands.
Okay. All right. So I kind of interrupted you. Do you remember?
I think, yeah. So we were talking about, I mean, I forgot exactly where we were, but we're basically just all of the things that we covered today. Like, so we've got teleonomy. It's teleonomy is purpose because of a goal.
Well, yeah, you had been saying that you thought they almost invented that term, sort of cover themselves, and then you said, but actually, I'm glad they did invent that distinction and I think that's where I jumped in.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad they invented the distinction, because there are things where we do have codes that yield goals. And so being able to say, once we recognize that something is teleonomic, well, then we know that they're under the control of the laws of physics. And once we know that, we can say, okay, well, the laws of physics and information theory govern how much can change here. There are not, I'm not going to say that there aren't laws of teleology, like, intent and action. because I think there are at some level, but we don't know what they are at present. But we do know a lot more about the laws of physics and the laws of information theory. And so once we know that a subsystem is governed by the laws of physics and information theory, we can then use those to better understand them. And so if once we recognize that evolution is, there's teleonomic process in evolution, then we can use information theory to reason about them. And that's where we get these different evolutionary, non-Darwinian evolutionary ideas that are more that are more compatible with the laws of information theory. That's, we talk about the conservation of information, the displacement theorem, these sorts of things. These tell us the conservation of information doesn't tell us anything about what a non-physical being would do, but it does tell us about what capabilities a physical being has. And so so if we say that this is, if we want to say evolution is completely limited by physics, well, then we have to take information theory seriously and say, okay, well, what does information theory tell us about how these things can come about? And it says that, well, as you go back in time, you're not going to get less information, you're going to need more. And so you can push these things back, but as you push them back, the design gets bigger. And these are things that you have to deal with. And so anyways, that's now it might be the case if you want to say that there wasn't much information content at the beginning, well, then you'd have to posit that there was a lot of, agency, that maybe instead of putting direct information in the original cell, that God put some sort of giant agency-oriented drive in this original organism, something that could create information. So something that was not physical that could create information, right? So these are the things that that you could posit if you were trying to say that if you're trying to preserve the idea that everything had a common ancestor, but you were trying to also contend with the fact that if it's a physical implementation of a code, then if it's a physical implementation of teleology, then it has to follow these rules. And so, anyway,
can I ask you a basic question? Because a standard academic in the information theory literature who's agnostic or atheist, what do they say? Like, is the total amount of information on planet Earth increasing over time as humans write more books and publish more YouTube videos and stuff? Is that a nonsense issue?
Well, I think that would not be a question that's generally asked. But there's the bigger problem is there's a lot of different questions you could be asking. So there's and I think
where I'm coming from is you keep referring to like the conservation of information. So I'm just trying to say, not in this context, just in general. Yeah. What does that mean? Like, what do people mean by that? They don't mean that humans can only know a certain finite amount of information and that's already been set in stone.
So in conservation of information, I'm specifically really familiar with it in terms of active information, which is the type of information that I deal with. And basically it's about orientation, and that you don't get more oriented towards a solution set you don't get more oriented towards a solution set by accident. The amount of orientation in a physical system, the amount of orientation that you can have towards a solution set is roughly fixed or withering. It's kind of like an entropy. If you think about it, it's along the same it's along the same lines and kind of the same theoretical basis. Is that if there's a lot of forms that it takes, like there's a data processing theorem that basically says you can't get more information than is already there. It's like kind of another way of saying it is torturing an uninformed witness won't get you any more facts or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just generate orientation towards a solution set from physical means. Now, of course, as far as like disk drives, we can fill data, we can add data all day long, but data is not orientation towards a solution set. Data is just recording things, and so you can add data all day long. To the extent that human knowledge is information and not just data, that it's actually oriented towards solutions that I think you actually can get more, because I don't think humans are purely physical beings. And I actually give some justification for that in my paper based on, if you think about it, this actually comes from Kurt Gödel, if you're familiar with him. And he actually, for these very same reasons, thought that the human mind was not material. And in fact, for these same reasons, didn't believe in evolution either, which was, in his case, was the Darwinian story. That was kind of the only one that was available in his time.
Okay, so I guess the narrow point I was just trying to unpack was standard information science people, when they say things like that oh yeah, you can't, the given closed system is not going to be able to generate new information on its own. So how does new information get into it? Like they think, humans put it in there, right? Like do they
yeah. So
kind of think, we can't explain the human. That's like a separate plane of existence, and that's not what we're talking about. And who knows?
I think that's kind of where you get the separation between the people who think that that artificial general intelligence is possible and those who don't.
Okay.
I've never quite understood the people who think that artificial general intelligence is possible. I haven't ever quite understood their argument, except maybe, again, similar to the people in the Darwinian camp, they have to take that position because
I used to be a material.
Alternative.
Yeah, I could tell. Yeah, it's got to be. Because we know I'm just a collection of cells, and my nervous system does blah, 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 and I produce these effects that you interpret as I have a mind.
Right.
So it's the same thing. Like,
exactly.
Okay.
So so the people who believe in artificial general intelligence, their view is basically that, physics is basically computation, and that's kind of what defines physics in general, is that you can take a prior state and compute a future state. So physics is basically computation, and so therefore, if the brains are entirely physical, then brains can be entirely emulated by computation, and by extension, we can therefore emulate the entire functioning of the human mind by computation. And so that's the view of artificial general intelligence. And so it makes sense as far as it goes. But if it isn't the case that human minds are entirely physical, then it leaves open, and I think a lot of the people who are open to the idea that humans are not entirely physical, most of them do not believe in artificial general intelligence, because they don't think that they think there are capabilities of humans that are not directly physical. And so anyway, I cover that briefly, but I cite a lot of references. If someone's interested, they can find the references in the paper. So,
okay, are we at a logical stopping point, or is there more you want?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good place to stop.
Okay, well, this has been fascinating, and of course, folks will put links to everything Jonathan has referenced, and probably some other things too that you sent me. I suppose, Jonathan, is there a place you can point people to if they want to follow you, or do you have stuff online? Do you have an online presence?
The main place I like to point people to is the Mind Matters blog. It's kind of a technology blog, but it covers a lot of technology, science, society. I'll post there things from latest computer science trends to intelligent design stuff. and that's mindmatters.ai, not .com. It's mindmatters.ai. And so I write there a lot, but there's a lot of other people who write there too.
Okay, great. Well, folks, my guest this week has been Jonathan Bartlett. Jonathan, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.